Know history before you judge people. I have been reading posts all over Facebook, and I keep seeing religious people down talking natives because they have respect for Mother Nature. And I'm going to say this clearly because it needs to be said. Having faith in Jesus does not give anyone the right to turn around and do the exact opposite of what he stood for, because using his name to shame people you don't understand is not faith. That is hypocrisy, plain and simple. And too many people are getting comfortable speaking on things they never took the time to learn, acting like Indigenous people are somehow wrong or less because their spirituality looks different, when in reality what you are seeing is a deep respect for life, for the earth, for balance, for creation itself. And instead of recognizing that, some people choose to mock it, dismiss it, or label it as something negative without even knowing the history behind it. And that's the problem right there. People want to judge before they understand. They want to speak before they learn. They want to criticize without context. And that is exactly how false narratives keep getting passed around like truth. Because let's be real for a second, before colonization, Indigenous people already had belief systems, already had moral codes, already had ways of living that emphasized respect, responsibility, and connection to the world around them. They were not lost. They were not empty, and they were definitely not waiting to be told how to live. They had structure, they had meaning, they had purpose. And when you take the time to actually learn that history instead of repeating what you've been told, you start to realize that a lot of what gets said about them is rooted in ignorance, not facts, and that matters, because words carry weight. And when you call people wrong or less, or try to shame them for beliefs you don't even understand, you are not standing in truth. You are standing in assumption, and that's not something anyone should be proud of, especially not while claiming to represent Jesus, because if you're going to bring his name into the conversation, then at least respect what he actually stood for, which was not tearing people down, not judging without understanding, not using faith as a weapon, but showing compassion, humility, and truth. And that's where the disconnect is happening. Because too many people are focused on feeling right instead of being informed. And that's why I'm saying this as direct as possible, before you shame anyone, before you point fingers, before you decide someone else is wrong because they don't believe what you believe. Learn the history. Take the time to understand where people come from, understand that different does not mean wrong, and recognize that respect for nature, respect for life, and respect for creation is not something to mock. It's something that should make you pause and think. Because maybe the issue isn't what they believe. Maybe the issue is how quickly people judge what they never took the time to understand. And that is something that needs to change. Because truth doesn't come from loud opinions. It comes from knowledge, and if more people focused on that, we wouldn't be having the same conversations over and over again. No, Indigenous peoples in the Americas did not attend church or believe in Jesus before colonization. But that doesn't mean they didn't have religion. In fact, they had deep, complex spiritual systems long before Europeans arrived. They didn't believe in Jesus because they had never heard of him, and that's not opinion, that's history, raw and simple, no spin, no agenda, just facts that people keep trying to twist into something else. So let's say it clearly and without fear. Before 1492, the people living in the Americas were completely cut off from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. There were no ships crossing back and forth, no shared languages, no communication lines, no exchange of ideas, nothing connecting those worlds. So when people ask why Indigenous people didn't believe in Jesus, the answer is direct. They didn't know him, they were never introduced to him, they never heard the name, never saw a Bible, never sat in a church, because none of that had reached them yet. And that matters because the life and teachings of Jesus Christ happened in a completely different part of the world, in the Middle East, and his message spread across regions like the Roman Empire and later Europe as Christianity. But that spread had limits. And those limits did not cross oceans at that time, so the idea that Indigenous people rejected Jesus is just not true. You can't reject something you were never given the chance to know. And that's where people need to slow down and think, because it changes the entire narrative. Now imagine this in a real human way, not textbook language. Imagine a group of people living on an isolated island, building their own language, their own culture, their own traditions, their own understanding of life. They raise families, they tell stories, they develop beliefs about where they came from and what happens after death. But they've never heard of modern science, never heard of global religions, never heard of anything outside their world. Does that make them wrong? Or does it mean they developed independently? Because that's exactly what happened in the Americas. Indigenous societies were not empty or lost or waiting to be given. Religion, they already had it. They had creation stories passed down for generations. They had spiritual laws that guided how they lived. They had ceremonies, rituals, and sacred traditions that connected them to the earth, to each other, and to something greater than themselves. They asked the same big questions every human being asks. Where do we come from? What is our purpose? What happens when we die? And they answered those questions in their own ways, rooted in their environment, their experiences, and their understanding of the world, not in Christianity. But that doesn't make it less real or less meaningful. It just makes it different. And then everything changed when Europeans arrived in the late 1400s, because that's when indigenous people were first introduced to Jesus. Not before. Missionaries came with a mission, churches were built. And in many cases, let's be honest, conversion was not a gentle invitation. It was forced, pressured, or tied to survival, which is a truth people don't always want to sit with. So if we're being real, exposure to Jesus came after colonization, not before, and that timeline matters. Because it corrects a lot of false narratives that still get repeated today. So here's the honest bottom line. No sugar coating, no bending facts. They did not know Jesus before Europeans arrived. They did not practice Christianity. And they absolutely had their own fully developed spiritual systems, rich, meaningful, and deeply rooted in their cultures. This was not a rejection of Jesus. It was a completely separate human story unfolding on another part of the planet. And understanding that doesn't take anything away from anyone's faith. It just tells the truth about history the way it actually happened, and sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's still the truth, and it deserves to be said out loud without fear. No, that does not mean they were bad, evil, or demon worshippers, not even close, and that narrative needs to be shut down because it's rooted in misunderstanding and pushed for generations to justify control over indigenous people. So let's be real and speak plainly. Just because a group of people believes something different does not make them evil. Indigenous spiritual systems were built on respect for life, balance with nature, community responsibility, and honoring ancestors. That is not darkness. That is structure. That is values. That is a moral framework. Just expressed differently than Christianity, and people need to stop acting like difference automatically equals danger, because it doesn't. Now let's talk about where this idea even came from. Because it didn't come from truth, it came from perspective. When Europeans arrived, many of them followed Christianity and believed it was the only true path, so when they encountered spiritual practices they didn't understand, they labeled them as pagan, savage, or even demonic, not because they actually knew what they were looking at, but because it was unfamiliar and outside of their belief system, and instead of trying to understand it, they judged it. And that judgment was then used as a tool to justify forcing conversions, taking land and suppressing entire cultures. So when people repeat that evil narrative today, whether they realize it or not, they are echoing a colonial mindset, not actual truth. Now let's ground this in reality. Across many indigenous cultures, spirituality focused on living in harmony with the earth, seeing nature as sacred, maintaining balance in life, and respecting all living things. That is not demon worship. That is a deep connection to existence itself. That is recognizing that life has value beyond just human control. And if we're being honest, a lot of those values reflect discipline, awareness, and responsibility, not evil. Now think about this in a real human way. If someone grows up never hearing about Jesus Christ, never being introduced to those teachings, never being exposed to that belief system, they are not rejecting him. They are not choosing evil. They are simply living within the knowledge and traditions they were given. That's it. No hidden agenda, no rebellion, just reality. And that matters because it shifts the entire conversation from judgment to understanding. So here is the real truth with no sugar coating. Not believing in Jesus does not make someone evil. Having a different spiritual system does not mean demon worship. Indigenous people had meaningful, structured belief systems, and many lived by strong moral and ethical values that guided their communities for generations. And that deserves to be acknowledged instead of dismissed, because history has shown over and over again that labeling people as evil simply because they are different leads to harm, not truth. And if we're serious about understanding the world, we have to be mature enough to separate what is unfamiliar from what is actually wrong, because those are not the same thing, and they never were. And the moment people start recognizing that difference does not equal evil is the moment real clarity begins. And that's the conversation more people need to be having right now, not fear-based assumptions, not recycled narratives, but honest understanding rooted in facts and respect. For everyone who is listening, this is why history is extremely important. For everyone who is listening, if you have not yet followed or subscribed, please feel free to follow my page so that you don't miss what's coming next. Please feel free to like, share, and comment. Thank you so much. With love always. Maria DC Santiago.